I don't talk much, mister, but I can cook. The words hung in the air between them, thin as the girl who spoke them. The lonely rancher looked at her, his gaze taking in the whole of her story in a single sweeping glance. Then, his own voice, rough as weathered leather, broke the silence. "You're hired," he said, "and you're home." It was the New Mexico Territory, in the late summer of 1879. The sun was bleeding out behind the dust-covered hills, casting long skeletal shadows across the plains. A weary wind stirred the red dirt on the road, lifting it into small swirls that danced over wagon ruts and brittle grass. The brutal heat of the day had broken, but the air still clung to the skin like a worn-out coat. Owen Booker stood on the porch of his ranch house, boots planted firm, arms crossed over his chest, watching the wind settle. He'd been fixing the hinges on the barn door when he heard it. A knock. Not loud, just enough to be certain. He turned. At the edge of his porch, standing as if she might collapse at any moment, was a girl. 19, maybe 20. She was as skinny as a fence rail, her boots nearly soleless, and she was wrapped in a shawl so worn the fringe blew like spider webs in the breeze. In her hands, she clutched a cast-iron pot as if it were solid gold. She did not smile. She did not beg. Her voice had cracked when she spoke, but her eyes held steady. "I don't talk much, mister, but I can cook." Owen said nothing. He studied her, noting the way her lips were chapped and split. He saw how her knees trembled, but never buckled. He saw how her hands were blistered, yet still gripped that pot, like it was the last piece of her mother she had left. His brow furrowed. "Name?" "Ellie May," she said, soft as a prayer. He looked past her, down the long, empty trail. No wagon, no mule, nothing but dust and the setting sun. "You got folks?" She shook her head once. His gaze fell to her bare fingers, wrapped around the handle of the pot. The rim had soot baked deep into it, as if it had seen more campfires than kitchens. For a long breath, nothing passed between them but the vast silence and the creak of old wood in the wind. Then he stepped aside. "You're hired," he said again. He added with a quiet that sounded almost like surrender, "And you're home." Ellie's shoulders dropped, not in defeat, but like someone laying down a weight they had carried too far. She stepped forward, her boots barely making a sound on the weathered planks. He did not take her hand. He did not ask for more. She passed him, her eyes scanning the porch, the door, the shadowed corners, and she walked into the house like someone tiptoeing into a half-forgotten memory. Inside, the place was clean but cold. Sparse furniture, no flowers. A kettle sat rusting on the back burner of the stove. The hearth was swept, but untouched by fire. She paused in the doorway, turning slightly. "Where should I sleep?" Owen pointed to a room at the back. "There's a cot. Sheets are clean. Water's in the basin. Tomorrow we'll talk chores. Tonight, you eat." She nodded once and disappeared down the hall. Owen stood alone a while longer as the sun sank completely from view. He looked out across his ranch, the dry fields, 2 cows, a half-collapsed chicken coop, and a silence that had lasted too many winters. Then he turned, went inside, shut the door behind him, and for the first time in a long time, didn't lock it. The scent of bread was always the first thing Ellie remembered about her childhood. Warm, thick, rising through the cracks in the floorboards. Her father, George May, had worked the ovens of the Millstone Bakery before dawn, his hands always covered in a fine dust of flour and a map of old burns. Her mother, Lillian, stitched aprons and hummed songs in a language whose name Ellie never learned. They were poor, but they were together. That held until the winter of '74, when her mother's cough turned bloody and the doctor said there was nothing to be done. Ellie was 14 when she watched her father press cold cloths to a forehead that no longer felt them. She buried her mother in a pauper's grave, with a wooden cross carved from her father's own bread paddle. Then came the mine collapse 2 years later. George had taken a second job digging for coal to pay off the debts from Lillian's medicine. They never found his legs. At 16, Ellie was alone. She tried to hold on to the bakery. She knew how to mix, how to knead, how to judge the rise of dough by smell alone. But in those parts, a woman wasn't allowed a business without a man's name attached. The landlord, a man named Cyrus Elwood, let her stay for a time, then began locking the back door and lingering too long when she bent over the hearth. She left one night with bruises hidden beneath her collar, and the cast-iron pot her mother had once used to stew blackberries. It was all she had left of them. She walked east first, toward Haddon's Fork, thinking the church might help. But the Reverend's wife clutched her Bible tighter when Ellie approached, and a boy at the general store shouted, "Ain't no husband following that one." She held out the pot, begging in silence. At the next town, she offered to cook for her board. The innkeeper let her wash dishes. On the third night, he opened her door without knocking. She broke his nose with a ladle and ran before dawn. 3 towns, 4 days, snow in her sleeves, blisters in her boots. She slept in haylofts, under wagons, once behind a blacksmith's forge where a drunk tossed his whiskey bottle at her for snoring. By the time she saw the wooden gate of a lonely ranch at the edge of nowhere, her lips were split raw. Her belly had forgotten the memory of warm food. She stood outside the fence, one hand clinging to the cast-iron pot, the other pulling her shawl tight across her ribs. "I don't want your pity," she whispered to no one. "Just your fire." Then the world tilted sideways. She didn't remember the fall, only the grit of dirt against her cheek, the sound of hooves, and a voice gruff and distant. "Someone get water." When she woke, it was not to sunrise, but to quiet, to warmth. It was the scent of oats boiling on a stove, a room with stone walls, a blanket that smelled of cedar, and a man with rough hands placing her pot beside the hearth as if it were made of glass. He hadn't taken it. That was how Ellie knew she had not been stolen from, only saved. And still, she kept one hand on its handle through the night, just in case. The door creaked as Owen opened it, revealing a room cloaked in shadow and dust. "You can stay here," he said simply, nodding toward the bed without meeting her eyes. His voice was steady, but the way he lingered at the threshold suggested the room meant more than his few words allowed. Ellie stepped inside. Her bare feet brushed against the cool floorboards, worn smooth from years of quiet footsteps. The air carried the faintest trace of lavender, long faded but stubborn in its persistence. The bed stood neatly made in the corner, a hand-stitched quilt pulled taut across it, the edges untouched by recent sleep. A lace doily, yellowed with time, sat atop the nightstand. A shelf on the wall held a wooden hairbrush, a cracked mirror, and a pair of embroidered gloves, stiff with age and memory. "This was hers?" Ellie asked softly. Not to pry, but to confirm what the room already told her, the way a place can whisper of loss without speaking at all. Owen gave the slightest nod, his gaze fixed on the doorframe. My wife, Clara. Fever took her, spring of 74. Ellie lowered her eyes, her own voice small. I will keep it clean. I promise. He stood there for a breath longer, then turned without another word and left her alone in the room where ghosts still lived. She remained in the silence for a long time, running her hand gently along the dresser's edge, careful not to shift anything. Dust clung to her fingertips. She walked to the window, its panes streaked with time, and pulled the curtain back just enough to let in a sliver of moonlight. Then, carefully, she folded her own worn blanket on a chair and sat on the edge of the bed, unsure if she belonged, but deeply grateful not to be outside. The next morning, Ellie opened her door to find a bundle of kindling and 2 fresh eggs resting on the bench just outside. No note, no knock. They were just there, a silent offering from a man who did not know how to say welcome. She brought them inside and stepped into the kitchen, then stopped. It was colder than she expected. The hearth had long gone cold. Cobwebs clung to the ceiling beams. The stovetop wore a coat of soft gray ash, as though the last fire had died quietly one night, and no one had the heart to wake it again. Pans rusted where hooks once held them proudly, their handles drooping like tired arms. She walked through it slowly, her fingers brushing along the counters. She saw the faint knife marks in the wood, where onions and apples had once been chopped. A tin of dried herbs, unopened, sat on a dusty shelf. She picked it up and turned it in her hand. Someone had loved this place, then left it all behind. She rolled up her sleeves, tied back her hair, found a rag, and boiled water. She scrubbed the counters until the grain of the wood showed through again. She opened every window, letting in the pale morning light. The wind was sharp, but it smelled clean. It felt like exhuming a memory. She found a chipped blue bowl tucked in the back of a cupboard, washed it twice, then cracked the eggs into it. Her hands shook, but the steady rhythm of whisking settled her. She added salt from a jar that was nearly full, chopped onions finely, and moved like someone who had always known how to work with fire and hunger. As the scent of eggs and heat began to fill the air, she reached up and rehung a sun-bleached curtain that had slipped from its hook. A triangle of golden light spilled across the old wooden floor, catching on something tucked between 2 books on a shelf. She leaned in. It was a photograph, worn and soft at the edges, barely clinging to its frame. A woman with kind eyes, and a boy smiling shyly beside her. Owen's wife. His son. Ellie stared at it for a long while, then bowed her head. I'll take good care of it, she whispered. She wasn't sure if she meant the photograph, the house, or the silence that still clung to its bones. Maybe all 3. Later that day, the floor creaked softly as Owen stepped just inside the kitchen, his shadow stretching toward the hearth. He paused, sniffing the air. Not intrusive, just curious. You used the time, he said. It was a statement, not a question. Ellie, wiping flour from her apron, looked up. It was still good. He nodded once. Clara liked thyme in her eggs. She met his eyes. Then I will keep using it. Owen left without another word, his boots thudding softly on the porch. That night, Ellie noticed the kindling by the stove was stacked a little higher, more carefully. And she stirred the stew a little longer, letting the warmth settle deep into the walls. and maybe into him. The snow had softened outside, the wind dying into a hush that let the ranch breathe again. Inside, the air warmed not just with fire, but with something unfamiliar, a scent that had not visited these walls in years. It was the scent of home. Chicken bones simmered gently on the stove, rosemary weaving its subtle promise through the rising steam, joined by the faint sweetness of fresh cornbread cooling by the hearth. Ellie stood by the stove, careful not to spill a drop, as she ladled chicken soup into a deep ceramic bowl that had once belonged to Owen's wife. The broth shimmered golden in the lantern light, filled with tender carrot rounds, cubed potatoes, and a whisper of rosemary. A recipe not from any cookbook, but embedded deep in her memory. It had been passed down from her mother, learned by heart around crackling stoves and lullabies that soothed a child to sleep. Beside the bowl, she placed a thick slice of cornbread, its edges browned just enough to break with a soft crunch. She ran her fingers over the crust, remembering the way her mother used to gently pat down the batter, humming melodies that felt like sunlight itself. She carried the plate to the table and stepped back. Owen was already seated, his rough hands folded on his lap, his eyes unreadable in the dim kitchen light. He watched the food with a quiet intensity, as though tasting something far beyond flavor. Ellie offered a quiet nod, her voice as soft as the falling snow outside. "It is nothing fancy, just a farm meal." He did not reply. Instead, he reached for the spoon and dipped it into the soup. The room fell into a silence thicker than the steam rising from the bowl. All she could hear was the slow scrape of metal against ceramic, the soft ticking of the mantel clock, and the subtle crackle of the hearth fire. Each moment stretched longer than the one before. She stood stiffly, hands clasped in front of her, waiting. Not for praise, but for permission to believe that this was enough. Owen finished half the bowl before setting the spoon down with deliberate care. He drew a long breath, as if tasting the words before letting them out. "Cornbread's the kind that holds together," he said, his voice low and measured. Ellie's shoulders eased as she nodded. "Cornmeal and lard. No eggs. Mama's trick when the hens wouldn't lay." He listened, his eyes still on the bowl. "Good soup." Her heart lifted, but her voice remained small. "Thank you." He rose then, leaving his spoon in the bowl, and stepped outside into the cold. The screen door slammed softly behind him. Ellie exhaled, her shoulders slumping as the tension finally left her body. She turned back toward the sink, still braced as though waiting for the moment he would change his mind. But instead, something settled inside her, something that felt like hope. Later that night, she made her way through the kitchen, a candle in hand, and a blanket wrapped tight around her shoulders. On impulse, she paused at the threshold, sensing him rather than seeing him. Owen stood by the window, barely moving, his figure outlined against the dark pane. The faint reflection of the hearth fire danced behind him. His arms were folded across his chest, silent and steady. From where she stood, she could feel the weight of his gaze, not on the night sky, but on the kitchen itself. The pot still sat on the stove, and the aroma of rosemary and thyme lingered in the air, sweet and earthy. He did not see her standing there, but Ellie saw everything. She saw the firm set of his jaw, the way his shoulders had relaxed, just a little. This was not a man distrustful of her cooking. This was a man who had not let anything close in many years, a man who had built walls of silence, brick by careful brick, to shield himself from the world's betrayals. And now she realized he feared that to enjoy something simple, a hot bowl of soup, a warm slice of cornbread, a quiet kitchen filled with ordinary life, was to risk remembering everything he had lost. She swallowed, her eyes fixed on his reflection. She whispered into the gloom, her words barely louder than a breath. You can trust the small things, Owen. Just the small things. Behind her, the fire did not die. It crackled gently, a promise that some warmth could return, and that some losses could be healed, one quiet meal at a time. The night sky unfolded wide over the plains, stars pricking the velvet dark like stitches of light. The wind was soft for once, curling around the porch like an old dog resting at their feet. Ellie sat on the top step, shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her knees pulled up to her chest. Owen sat beside her, boots planted firm on the ground, his hat tipped low. They had eaten supper in silence, roasted turnips, leftover stew, and slices of that morning's cornbread. Now they sat together, not talking, not needing to. The quiet was not awkward. It was full, the kind of silence that held space like a blanket between them. After a while, Ellie broke it, her voice gentle. My mama once burned a whole tray of biscuits, she said. Left them in too long while telling me a story about how Papa asked her to marry him. Owen tilted his head, his eyes still on the sky. We didn't have much that day. She was so mad at herself, crying and cursing. But my papa just took one, said, burned love's still love if it's warm, and ate the whole thing. A quiet laugh escaped her. I laughed so hard I nearly choked. Then Mama started laughing too. She always did get mad at herself more than anyone else. Owen's lips quirked at the corners. Then, barely, he chuckled. It was a soft, short sound, but it was real. It was the first time Ellie had heard him laugh. She turned slightly, stealing a glance. In the starlight, his face looked gentler, the shadows kinder. She said nothing more, just let the moment sit there between them. When the night deepened and they stood to go inside, Owen paused by the door. I'll fix the dining table tomorrow, he said. Ellie blinked. Why? He shrugged, his voice low. You need space to roll dough. That old sideboard's too narrow. Ellie nodded, her heart catching a little. Thank you, she said. The next morning, before sunrise, she found him in the dining room, sleeves rolled up, sanding the edge of the long oak table. Its surface had warped over the years, bent from heat and spills and time. He worked quietly, methodically, smoothing the wood with patient care. She stood in the doorway, watching him. You don't need to, she said. He kept sanding. You don't ask for much. Just seems right. That afternoon, she baked again. This time it was sweet rolls, light and golden, brushed with honey. When she brought him one, he took it in his calloused hand and bit into it without a word. But when he looked at her, just for a moment, just a glance, she saw that something had shifted. Not much, but something. A week later, she found a new rolling pin on the shelf. Not new, exactly, but newly carved from oak, shaped by a knowing hand. It fit her grip perfectly. There was no note, no mention of it, but she knew. And she whispered into the flower that morning, some men love louder without words. And the dough rose just fine. The day had been long and dry. Ellie had spent the morning kneading bread, and the afternoon hanging wet linens across the fence line. The wind tugged at them like restless hands, and she could feel a storm building in the air, though the sky above stayed a hard, empty blue. By sundown, she was in the kitchen, dusting flour from her apron, when the knock came. The knock didn't come at the front door. It came from the side gate. 3 slow, deliberate raps against the wooden post that echoed in the unnatural quiet of the afternoon. Owen was still out in the pasture, a distant figure checking the irrigation ditch. Wiping her hands on a damp rag, Ellie stepped onto the porch, her heart beginning a familiar, heavy thud against her ribs, the way it always did when the world went too still. A man was waiting at the gate. He was tall and lean, with a crooked smile that never quite reached his eyes. There was no kindness in it. "Well, I'll be," he said, his voice a low drawl she remembered all too well. "Ain't this a surprise?" Ellie froze, the rag twisting in her grip. Silas. The name was a ghost from a life she'd fled. He'd lived just 2 rooms down from her at the boarding house in Junction Hollow. He'd never laid a hand on her, but his eyes had. His voice, too sweet and slick, always smelled of sweat and sour whiskey. He'd offered her things she never wanted, then turned cruel when she'd refused. "I was just passing through," he said, his gaze drifting over her, taking in the clean dress, the porch flowers, the fresh laundry drying on the line. "Saw the smoke from your chimney. Didn't think I'd find you of all people." He took a step closer. "Look at you, doing all right for yourself." She opened her mouth, but the words were caught in her throat. "You still cooking?" he went on, his eyes scanning the yard. "I remember that stew you made for the old widow. Smelled like Sunday supper." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Funny, you never did say goodbye when you left. I thought we were friends." Ellie took a step back, and then another sound cut through the quiet. Bootsteps, firm and purposeful. Owen. He'd come back from the pasture, moving with a silence that seemed to rise from the land itself, as if it had warned him. His shirt was damp, one glove half pulled off. His eyes locked on Silas, and he said nothing, just moved to stand beside Ellie. Then he did something she would never forget. Without a word, he laid his hand gently on her shoulder. It was a small gesture, but it anchored her to the ground. It said, "I am here. You are not alone." When Owen finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of the land itself. "She's not going anywhere," he said. "She belongs here." Silas blinked. The charm on his face flickered and died. "Well, I didn't mean nothing by it," he muttered, taking a step back. "Just passing through." He tipped his hat. "Good day to you, Miss Ellie." Then he turned and disappeared into the dust. Ellie stood motionless, her breath caught somewhere in her chest. Owen didn't tighten his grip or look down at her. He just kept his hand there for a moment longer, a silent reassurance before letting go and giving her space. She turned to him. "Thank you," she said, her voice shaking. "You don't owe me thanks," he replied, his gaze steady. "A good cook deserves a safe kitchen." But his eyes said more. Later that night, Ellie stood by the window, watching the horizon long after the sun had set. But when she walked into the kitchen the next morning, a fresh horseshoe hung above the back door, a quiet ward against the world, a silent promise. And she knew, without having to ask, that Owen had put it there. She touched the cool curve of the iron, then went to stoke the fire. For the first time in her life, someone had stood up for her, without demand or condition. Just because she was there. Just because she mattered. And that made all the difference. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, painting the worn wooden floor in ribbons of gold. Barefoot on the cool planks, Ellie rolled up her sleeves, her fingers dusted with flour. The dough was soft and pliant beneath her hands, rich with buttermilk and promise. Behind her, Owen lingered by the door, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "You said you never learned to bake," she said, without turning. "I did not," he admitted. "Always been better at burning things." She smiled, patting the dough. "Then today, we fix that." He hesitated, then pulled up a chair at the long table. Ellie guided him through it, her voice calm and patient. "Cut, press, fold. Don't overwork it. The butter has to stay cold." His large hands, so deft with rope and leather, were clumsy with the delicate dough. One biscuit came out lopsided, another too thin. She laughed, a warm, gentle sound. "That one looks like Kansas after the floods," she teased. He looked down at his creation and let out a low chuckle. "Still better than the last one." "Progress," she said, her eyes gleaming. The oven warmed the small room, and soon the scent of baking biscuits filled the air, buttery and slightly sweet. It was the scent of home, a memory she hadn't realized she was chasing. They sat side by side as the biscuits browned, talking of small things. She told him about her mother's apron, patched so many times it looked like a quilt. He told her about his first horse, a stubborn mare named June. "You still have that apron?" he asked quietly. Ellie looked down at her hands. "No, I had to leave it behind." He nodded, saying nothing more. When the biscuits were golden, she pulled them from the oven. Owen reached for one too soon, burning his fingers. "Hot," he muttered. "Told you," she said, laughing again. He blew on it and tried again. A slow, thoughtful chew. His expression shifted subtly. "It's good," he said, as if surprised. "Of course it is," she replied with mock offense. He took another bite. "This one's different." Ellie paused. "How so?" "It tastes like the start of something," he said, struggling for the words. "Not just food. Something new." She blushed and looked away. The next morning she walked into the kitchen expecting the usual quiet rhythm. But something else was waiting on the center of the table. A small bundle tied with twine. She unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a cluster of wildflowers, clover, sage, and 2 early daisies. Owen came in a moment later, his boots heavy on the floor. He washed his hands at the sink, then nodded toward the flowers. "For the kitchen," he said simply. "Makes it smell like life again." Ellie brushed a finger over a delicate petal. "Thank you," she whispered. He just nodded and went back outside. Later that day, she found herself humming as she kneaded dough. It was a tune her mother used to sing when she thought no one was listening. It rose to her lips as if it had been waiting there all along. That evening, they sat on the porch and watched the sky burn gold. Neither said much, but the silence between them was different now. It was a comfortable wait, not an empty space. Ellie noticed how his arm rested on the railing, just a little closer than before. How he exhaled like a man who was finally, truly, breathing again. "You ever think about what it means to stay?" she asked, her voice barely disturbing the twilight. He tilted his head. Meaning? She shrugged. Most people I've known were always running. From places. From themselves. But here, staying doesn't feel like being stuck. He looked at her for a long time. I've been stuck before, he said. This don't feel like that. She smiled, soft and slow. No, it don't. There were no grand declarations, just the quiet warmth of two people learning how to belong. And in that simple silence, surrounded by biscuits and wildflowers, a new beginning was taking root. Spring returned to the plains, gentle and green. The ranch, once so quiet it felt haunted, now hummed with a simple rhythm. Fences mended, soil tilled, biscuits rising before the sun. The kitchen was its heart, alive with laughter and the smell of home. Ellie stood by the window, watching Owen hammer a new beam into the porch rail, his shirt clinging to his back. A letter sat folded on the table behind her. It was an offer. The mayor's wife had tasted her peach cobbler and declared it the best this side of Abilene. There was a storefront in town, a small kitchen waiting for a baker. A chance for her own shop, her own name above the door. A life built by her own two hands, beholden to no one. That evening, she found Owen on the porch. She sat beside him and placed a fresh loaf of sourdough between them. I was thinking I might go, she said quietly. Town's got a kitchen waiting. A proper stove, real customers. Owen nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. You should, he said, his voice even. If that's where your heart is leanin'. Ellie swallowed hard. It's not about heart. It's about not missing what could be mine. I understand, he said. He stood and went back inside, leaving her alone with the untouched bread and a night that suddenly felt colder than it had all week. The next morning, just after sunrise, Owen was in the barn when he heard footsteps. It was Ellie. I made it to the edge of town, she said, her voice clear and certain. He turned, his work forgotten. She stood there, still in her apron, a warm loaf tucked under her arm. Her travel sack was nowhere in sight. The sun was hitting that ridge, she went on, and I just couldn't go. She took a step closer, holding out the loaf. I'm not leaving. Not unless you fire me. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn cloth. He unfolded it to reveal a silver ring. It was modest, scuffed with age but whole and clean. He pressed it into her flour-dusted palm. Then you're not just hired, he said, his voice low and rough with emotion. You're home. Ellie blinked back tears, her fingers closing around the ring. I hope you like biscuits every day, she whispered. A slow smile spread across his face. As long as they come with you. The sun rose higher, casting a warm light over the ranch house. Inside the kitchen, the fire crackled. 2 mugs of coffee waited on the table, and beside them, a single wildflower stood in a mason jar. It was not a grand proposal. It was something quieter and stronger. It was love in the shape of a warm loaf, a silver ring, and a place by the fire. It was a man who said little, but who had said everything. Because sometimes, your home is the only vow you ever need. If this story stirred something in your heart, the quiet strength of a man's love, the fierce resilience of a woman's will, the simple grace of a home built from kindness, then there are more tales waiting for you on this journey through through the old American frontier. Subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for timeless romances born from dust and devotion. Stories where words are few, but hearts speak volumes. Where love is not just found, it's forged. Because out here, in the vast quiet of the West, even the loneliest souls can find their way home, one firelight night at a time.